about the Hammond boys, so won't count on it. We'll just.
Who was it that said they'd be coming in late?
That was Jeremy. So the older brother is going to be coming in late. The younger brothers might not show up at all. I don't know. Anyways, been a bit since we met, so let's try to do a quick catch up in our story so far to where we left off. So Tarquin was the last king of Rome, right?
Yeah.
And he was driven out of the city by basically the patricians. When he was driven out of the city, he tried to regain his kingship. Remember the first way he tried to do it?
With trying to get people to open city gates.
Yeah, so he sent in some ambassadors basically to ask for his personal property back. And while they were there and the Senate was debating it, they were really trying to drum up support for Tarquin and see if they could get him to open the gates to him. He could just enter with his bodyguard and retake control of Rome the way he did the first time. So that was his plan, got caught, that didn't work out. Then there was his second attempt at getting that. Remember what the second attempt was?
He wanted to be the Etruscans.
Yeah, he went to the Etruscans. Now, in particular, remember, the Etruscans are together in a loose sort of confederation between them. And so, in particular, he went to the city of Veii, which is like Rome's main Etruscan enemies, and then the city of Tarquinia, named differently on that map, but city of Tarquinia, where the Tarquins ultimately hail from. And so those two cities agreed to work together to take Rome and put him back as the king of Rome and basically make Rome an Etruscan city. Now they go, they fight that battle. Remember, one more Etruscan died than Roman, so the Romans won the war. But eventually, what really ended up happening is Veii and Tarquinia realized it's going to be a hard-fought war. We're doing all this sacrifice to essentially give someone else a city, just not worth it. So they back out of the war. And so then we were on to his third attempt. What was his third attempt? His third attempt was to run to Porsena, who's the head of Clusium, which is named different on there. So Clusium is that city-state right there. Now at this time, this is pretty much considered the greatest of the Etruscan cities. And Porsena, Lars Porsena, he has a big reputation. People know who he is. He already has a reputation as a great king in a great city, as a great general. And so Tarquin was able to convince him to take on this war effort and march on Rome. And so that's exactly what Porsena ended up doing. Now we talked about how he came. He really quick took the Janiculum, that's a hill over here, and there's a fort on top of there. So that's his base of operations that he's operating from. They were able to, there was a bridge, I think the bridge, I'm not sure exactly where the bridge is supposed to go, but there was some bridge into Rome, and remember one of our heroes single-handedly held off the bridge while the Romans who crossed it burned it down, otherwise the war would have been lost before it even started. So that was our first, Herodias, he was our first hero that we talked about last time. And then we had our second hero. Here Porsena is, and he's kind of got Rome locked up inside their city, can't really gather food, slowly starving them out. Our next guy, Gaius Mucius, he's the one who snuck out of the city, snuck into the camp, tried to kill Porsena, but didn't know what he looked like and accidentally killed his secretary instead of him. And when Porsena says, tell me about what you guys are trying to do to kill me or else I'll burn you, he's the one who stuck his hand into the fire, basically saying, do it, I dare you. Doesn't scare me. And Porsena ends up letting him go. And he told Porsena that there were 299 others of them, 300 total, who had all agreed to take their turn coming and trying to kill Porsena. Porsena thinks these guys are nuts. This isn't worth it. He almost got me on the first try. I can't handle 299 other of these. And so he negotiates peace talks with Rome. The agreement was that Rome would first off hand over some hostages to make sure that the treaty would be honored. And the second part of the treaty is that all the land that Rome had taken from Veii, basically all the land north of the Tiber that Rome had control of, they had to give up. So hostages and the land north of the Tiber pretty much is what they're forced to give up. And then we got our third Roman hero, Cloelia. And Cloelia, she was one of these hostages when they're taken over to the camp before Porsena has a chance to leave. She takes all the girls with her, basically, and they escape, swim across the river, and return back to their families. Porsena said, no, that's a breach of our treaty. You can keep all the other girls who escaped, but the one who instigated this all, send her back. And the Romans do, they send her back. Porsena is so impressed with this. Remember, one of the main reasons that you hang on to these hostages is to make sure that they will honor the treaty that you put in place. And so he says, this shows such good faith amongst the Romans that I don't need all these hostages, and he lets her leave again with half the hostages. And the hostages basically agree amongst themselves, take the women and children, and the older guys can be the ones who stay as the hostages. So I think that's roughly where we left it off. Porsena getting ready to leave, and half the hostages already being returned back to Rome. Any questions about how we're setting up our story so far before we continue from there? Hopefully that was a good enough recap.
That was a generous solid.
Okay, so moving forward. So Porsena, he's now come to this peace treaty. He's decided it is time to leave. Now, when he goes on this military expedition, maybe just leave it here for a second, just to talk about it. When you go on this military expedition, you have to bring all of your supplies with you. He had come getting ready to hold out in a long siege against the Romans. Since they kind of already come to peace talks, he takes a good chunk of his army and he just leaves. He sends a piece of his army to do something else, to leave the Romans alone. But the point is, he brought way more supplies than what he needed. And he knows that they've pretty much been starving out the Romans and taking as much of their food supplies as he can. So when he leaves the Janiculum stocked with a bunch of food supplies for the Romans. And this is often referred to as the goods of Porsena. It was an expression that was used in Livy's day. To give you kind of an equivalent, we use Einstein to call someone a genius. The goods of Porsena, that was an expression that you would use when someone who you thought wanted to do you harm turned around and actually did something nice to you. And so it was an expression down all the way in Livy's day, and it was a consequence of this act right here. So that was the goods of Porsena left in the Janiculum for him, so that Rome had access to some food supplies for the people. Very kind thing. Now, Porsena, he takes his army, he's going back to Clusium. He doesn't want this march to be for nothing. Let me pull up another map. This one will work. He doesn't want this march to be for nothing, so he sends his son with a portion of the army to come down and take the city of Aricia. So, city down here. Why? I'm not exactly positive why Aricia wasn't part of the Latin League, so it would have been one that was well established. Rome has no right to. So, trying to make the military effort worth it, the fact that they went through all this work. And so that's where his son is marching off with a portion of the army. Porsena took a portion of his army home. Now, when the Aricians get word that Arnus, Porsena's son, basically a portion of Porsena's army, is coming down to attack them, they have some heads up. They're really quick able to drum up support from the Latins to help them get an army. But on top of that, they're able to get support from a Greek city-state. All the way down off the map here, Cumae is the name of the Greek city-state. And they have a decent fleet, so they're able to get the troops up there fast enough.
Wow.
And so they're able to use those two to help them in their fight against these Etruscans, against Porsena's men, Etruscans. Remember, Porsena is ultimately an Etruscan. So that's what we're talking about on the map. So Arnus, son of Porsena, is the one leading these Etruscan troops against the Aricia. The Aricians is who he's leading them against, and they're getting support from the Latins and from a Greek city-state by the name of Cumae. Now, what ends up happening in this battle is early on, so you got your Aricians, they're coming down and attacking, the three armies joined together to try and fight this Etruscan army. What ends up happening is the Etruscans completely overpower him. And so they push him back really quick. The mercenaries, or whatever they were, I assume they were mercenaries, but I'm not positive, from Cumae, they, upon this happening, kind of just intentionally give ground and turn to the side over here. And so these guys keep pushing forward, and so if you fast forward some, here's the bulk of the Arician army, here's the two armies that are pushing back, while the guys from Cumae, they kind of push off to the side. And then once the Aricians push back fast enough, because of how fast these guys are retreating, remember, when the army's retreating, that's your chance. And so they're advancing quickly on these armies as they're retreating. Cumae keeps organized, and once the Aricians get fast enough, they then come from behind. And what was an obvious victory quickly turns into a defeat for the Etruscans. Because once you got your enemy behind you, you're just done for. So they're able to turn and somewhat put up a fight, but with these guys behind them and organized, it's just over. And so this army gets destroyed. I think Aaron ends up dying in the battle. Not positive on that. But it's a huge defeat for the Etruscans. And now, what do? When they get defeated, showing you again on this map where they are, they're clear down, fighting down here. Remember that some Latin cities, I'm not sure which ones, were the ones who are giving one of the armies to help fight, and they're right outside the enemy city. And so the only people in the area that they're on any friendly terms with are the Romans. And so they book it all the way back to Rome. And so Rome opens her gates to them and allows the soldiers to come and stay in Rome. One, to get relief from being attacked, and two, they're able to stay there until they're able to recover from their wounds and go on their merry way back to the Etruscans. Make sense so far, all that? Anyways, a bunch of these survivors from the battle, they end up loving it in Rome so much, a bunch of them decide that they're just going to stick around, and they're going to become Romans. And so the Romans will let them in, and Livy says in his day they had something called the Tuscan Street, and the reason it got its name is because that's where a bunch of these Etruscans came and decided to live after this defeat. And so they actually end up integrating in right there into the Roman population. Any questions so far? So, and once again, this is seen as Rome doing something kind for Porsena. So Porsena is doing kind things for Rome, and Rome's doing kind things for Porsena, this guy that they were just at war with. And so what you're seeing develop is this friendship between the city of Rome and Porsena. Now, Porsena is still an Etruscan, and he still has Tarquin right there, the king trying to get back his city, pushing Porsena to get the city back. Porsena hasn't given up on taking the city of Rome. He's just decided that he's not going to do it militarily. He doesn't want to kill anyone in the process, and he wants to negotiate how we can make this happen. What's it going to take, patricians, in order for you guys to step aside and let King Tarquin come back and be in power? So he sends his ambassadors to the city of Rome, Porsena sending his ambassadors to the city of Rome, basically asking them, what's it going to take in order for you guys to restore Tarquin to the throne? Now, the Roman Senate, they're kind of in a twist. They don't know how to answer this, because there's no way that they're going to allow this to happen, but they don't just want to tell them no and have them go back and tell Porsena that they just said no and it's not negotiable. They don't want to come across as rude while trying to communicate this. So they decide that the best way to do it is, rather than giving an answer to his ambassadors, they send some actual senators all the way up to Clusium, up to Porsena, to answer him in person what their response is. And so what they explain to him is that it was the wish of all, meaning all the citizens of Rome, that their city might have the same period of existence as their freedom in that city. So they want the city to exist as long as they have their freedom in the city. If you take away their freedom, you may as well take away the city. Wherefore, if he wished Rome to be safe, they entreated that he would suffer it to be free. And they go on to say that we are now good friends, and there's hardly anything you could ask us for that we won't be willing to provide you with, save our own destruction. And this one thing that you keep pushing is the one thing that is equivalent to our destruction in our minds. And so for the sake of our friendship, we ask you to stop asking for this. If you have something else you'd like to request, okay, but stop asking us to reinstate the Tarquins as king. And once again, Porsena is impressed by the Romans, and he decides he doesn't want to do anything to interfere with the friendship between him and the Romans. So he goes on and he releases the rest of the hostages, gives them back to the Romans. On top of that, he returns all of these lands, those lands north of the Tiber, back to Rome.
Wow.
This was Rome took these lands from an Etruscan city. Porsena, an Etruscan city, takes them back, and then he gives them to Rome, not to me. Shows you the type of friendship he had with these guys. And on top of that, he tells Tarquin, basically, I'm not going to participate in this anymore. I'm not going to say it's a bad idea. I'm not saying it's a good idea to retake the city. I'm saying I'm out. So you're going to have to go somewhere else.
So he had power over these lands? Wasn't he in the entire...
So he took these lands. He didn't necessarily return them to V, although you could probably speculate that that was his long-term plan, was to somehow negotiate something with V where he gives the lands back to V. So he hadn't ever given it back to V, so it was still just him giving back exactly what he took from Rome. Good. Any other questions? Okay. And so that kind of ends our story of Porsena and how he relates to Rome. and we won't hear about him again.
It's too bad.
Did you
Poor
go
guy.
him telling Tarquin to leave?
Yeah, so he basically tells Tarquin, I'm out. It's not really that he's forcing Tarquin to leave, although that's probably the verbiage I used here. He's basically telling Tarquin, I'm no longer going to participate in any way. Tarquin's still determined to try and get Rome back. And in his mind, there's just one more guy that he's got to go to. So whether Tarquin was forced to leave or whether he just chose to leave since he knew Porsena wasn't going to participate anymore, I don't know. But in any event, Tarquin ends up leaving, and he goes to Tusculum. Now, we've heard that city's name before. Tusculum is a powerful Latin city. Tarquin, when he was trying to get legitimacy amongst the Latins, way back when he was king, he married his daughter to the king or whatever at Tusculum. So the leader at Tusculum is his son-in-law. So he tried to retake the city with a conspiracy. That didn't work. He tried to use the Etruscans. That's not going to work. Time to move on to the Latins to see if we can use the Latins to try and retake the Romans. That's his plan. By going to the most powerful Latin city available to him, which happens to be his son-in-law, and he did that deliberately at the time to marry into the most powerful Latin cities. Any questions with that before we move forward some? Now, I remember last time, or maybe it was the time before, but I think it was last time, talking about the Phalanx, and seemed like some of you weren't positive what exactly this was. So let's go over just how fighting is going on at this time and try to help you actually picture in your head what a battle would look like. So the majority of the soldiers at this time are what are called hoplites. A hoplite is someone who largely uses heavy armor, a spear, and a big shield. Now, the way that they fight is in this type of formation, usually 8 men deep. Now, unfortunately, all of the pictures that we see here are going to be of hoplites under Alexander the Great, and he makes changes to it. So, at this time, the shields would have been bigger and the spears would have been shorter. Alexander the Great changed it so that 5 rows of spears could reach the front at the time. In the phalanxes we're talking about, only 3 rows of spears could reach out at a time. So shorter spears, they used their spears with one hand and they wielded their shield with another hand. And it was more of a wall of shields with spears sticking out than a wall of spears. And to give you some of their actual tactics, using one shield, one arm for the shield, they would overlap it so that your shield would rest on top of the person next to you and under the person on the other side of you to distribute the weight as people pushed against you, creating just a wall of shields with spears sticking out. This innovation, making the shield smaller, but 2 hands using the spears, just made you doing more, offense is best defense type thinking. So this isn't quite what it looked like. It's what all the pictures are going to be since Alexander the Great's so famous. But it gives you the idea of what it was. And so, the idea now in a battle would be that you would take these things, but make it really long so that the enemy can't get around you. And so this is trying to give you a picture of what that might have looked like from the side. Just a wall of spears that the enemy is not going to want to charge into. So that's a phalanx. What's the advantages of a phalanx? Pretty stupid to come at them from the front. You're going to die. The disadvantages of a phalanx is they are very packed together, and so they are very immobile. When the soldiers are in this position, they can't move forward very fast. If they're going to move forward quickly to chase down the enemy, they basically have to break formation, which is what just happened in the last battle that we talked about. When I told you that the soldiers from Cumae moved to the side, and then you had the Aresians chasing down the other 2 armies, they basically had to break formation to chase them down. And then when these guys got behind them and formed up, now you're just dead. Because all these guys now have to do is turn around and slow you down. And then you're getting murdered from behind. So, advantages to this, basically undefeatable from the front. The disadvantages to it is they are very immobile. And they are also very susceptible to be attacked from the side.
Very slow too.
Yeah, very slow moving, can't turn. You might think, why can't they turn? I mean, it's just simple, you just turn. Understand that when you turn an army, if I turn this army now to face this way, this poor guy would have to run all the way up there. So even turning requires a lot of movement. So they can't turn much, they can't move fast, and they're very susceptible from the sides. How well are these guys protecting against an attack coming this way? Not at all. So what you would do with these phalanxes is you would line up your army in a really long line, 8 men deep. And so you have just walls of spears coming out like this, but you have to protect your sides. And so you would have lighter armed troops protecting your flanks. These would be guys who would mostly be like javelin throwers or slingers, stuff like that. People who can be really mobile. They're not really there to fight you or slow you down. And then protecting their flanks, this is typically where your cavalry went. Your guys on horseback. One of their major military rules is simply protecting the flanks. Charging in with military, that doesn't really happen until Alexander the Great. And so that's roughly what it looks like. So that's how one army's lining up, the other army lining up the same way, the bulk of the fighting being done in the middle between the two phalanxes. And a lot of tactics at this time are going to be somehow getting armies to the side behind, break up this formation. Because if you can break up their phalanx, you won the battle. Make sense?
Was it oftentimes phalanx against phalanx?
Yes. It's very frequently phalanx against phalanx, which is why when Alexander the Great made this innovation, he had a huge advantage over the Greeks.
Just having a slightly longer spear.
Just having longer spears. So I'm doing damage to you before you can even reach me. Not only am I doing, 2 guys are doing damage to you before you can even reach me.
Seems kind of obvious.
Huh?
Seems kind of obvious, that idea of making the spears longer.
Well, the trade-off there with making the spears longer is I had to make the shield smaller. Your spears are now two-handed. They're too heavy to wield just one-handed. And so it makes you even less mobile because the spears are more unwieldy.
Couldn't you theoretically defend your back as well?
Yeah, why don't they just turn around?
Just do a 180.
They're just like have.
There is not some send the message down the line. Everyone's wearing a headset. Hey, turn around. Communication is a huge problem in these battles. And so you can only have very basic commands that you give in very basic ways. Like with a particular trumpet means march forward. Another trumpet means stop.
There could be one for.
For flip around? No. And pulling that off and maintaining your order just doesn't work. I mean, think about in practice what that would mean here. Because these guys just flipping around, it's not really the same effect.
They need at least 4 or 5 rows.
So how many rows do you have to flip around? And do you double them up so you can always flip around? If you double them up, you can't make your line as long.
Yeah.
And so you're more susceptible to being flanked. So, that's the basic tactics of military at the time of using these phalanxes, and that's pretty much what people are using. Okay, so any more questions about that? And hopefully that helps as we talk about some of the battle tactics make more sense.
So there's nothing else besides like the cavalry on the sides.
No, there are. And it's not like, oh, so they gradually get less armed
Right.
and more mobile as you go out. And so the Romans, they had like their, remember how we had the comitia by century and all the centuries? And we had the number of centuries in each one. And so you had 80 were the bulk of your army, and that was your heavy infantry, those would be in the middle. But then you had slightly less troops, slightly less armed, slightly less armed troops, slightly less armed troops. And so what that's doing is making them lighter, quicker, more mobile, and it's easier for them to protect the flanks. But the bulk of the fighting and the bulk of your army was your phalanx. And so yeah, all the way toward the ends, you would just have guys throwing javelins or slingers throwing rocks to keep people from getting close enough to flank you. And then finally cavalry. So if they were trying to run around you and flank you really quick, the cavalry are the ones who can quickly engage and stop them from doing that and just lock them up while your phalanx tries to win the battle.
So, did they use the cavalry in any kind of offensive role?
Flanking.
Just flanking?
Flanking is largely how cavalry is used. Somehow get around, get behind the enemy. And so that's why you often have the cavalry tying down the cavalry, and they're usually both on the end, somehow trying to get around the enemy. It's a common way that they're used. But in practice, what ends up is the cavalry end up locking up with each other, tying each other down.
So with the previous battle that just happened, they must have planned that whole strategy to have partial retreat turnaround?
There isn't enough detail to
Because,
know.
one, you've taught us the fact that once people start running, they run all the way home. Like, there's no just, oh, quick, turn around, they're getting flanked. It just seems like there's too much chaos.
It turns to chaos, and a crowd running in chaos is often much, much slower than a crowd just marching on.
Yeah, but it's hard to believe that they would be getting destroyed and then be running off and somehow veer off and then decide, oh, hey, never mind, everyone let's
Oh,
just
they
go.
intentionally gave way.
Okay, that's what
They saw the other two armies giving way, and so they intentionally tried backing off and slowly maneuvering to let them go. Because now understand, if you are one of these Etruscans, the guy right here, he sees the guy in front of him running off. You're the guy right next to him. And you see, but these guys are still standing there. Do I go with you on the chase, or do I stay and fight this guy? And you might say, I should probably stay and fight this guy, but the guy right next to you might think, no, we're still going that way. There's no, you guys do this, you guys do that. It's just people right there making decisions on the fly, no clue how to do it. And so what ended up happening in practice is they saw the easy kills this way, and so they kept going towards the easy kills. And saying those guys are probably just withdrawing from the battle. They already see it's a loss, so we'll just take out these two armies, or however they rationalize in the moment, who knows. But, yeah.
right.
Okay. Anything else there? Okay. So, that's what ends up happening with Porsena. Porsena is now out of the picture. Tarquin, he's now in Tusculum, right here, Latin city. And so now that's where he's located. And now,
Don't the Latins hate him?
sorry, what?
Don't the Latins hate him as well?
Some do, some not so much. I mean, remember, he was actually a good general, and he led the Latins to a bunch of victories, conquering more cities and bringing them into the Latin League. And then the city that he's at, I mean, it's literally family. So, no, he was largely welcome at the city is the only way I can read it. Anyways, so Rome now takes care of that threat. The Sabines are always causing problems. Sabines are up here. Sabines are always causing problems for the Romans, and so the Sabines, they start some small war and quickly lose the war to the Romans. So some quick battle, some quick victory for the Romans, decisive victory. With that, the Sabines decide that it's time to prepare for a much larger war. And so they start preparations for a large war, and Rome gets word that they are setting up preparations for a larger war, so Rome has to be ready for that as well. And remember, a bunch of Sabines are also Romans. So there's a lot of connection there and a lot of communication about what's going on in different places. A lot of family ties back and forth between these two peoples. Now, Appius Claudius, he was a noble amongst the Sabines. Not a Roman. Noble amongst the Sabines. While the Sabines are discussing making preparations to launch a larger war against Rome, he is the one advocating for peace. He says, no, we should be taking this time to establish peace with the Romans. We shouldn't be trying to kick them when they're down, so to speak, because they know that Rome has been dealing with conflict after conflict after conflict. Rome's been fighting for its life ever since Tarquin left. So he advocates for peace. He's not popular with the Sabines. They don't like that. They want war with the Romans. And so him being a noble and basically his clan are kind of driven out from amongst the Sabines. And so they go and they move in with the Romans. And the Romans largely welcome them. They allow Appius Claudius and some of the more nobles amongst the Sabines to become nobles, patricians there in Rome. And so he's able to basically instantly join the Senate, and his clan is able to get settled as one of the clans. And so one of the clans of Rome was the Claudian clan. So we just watched a clan actually enter Rome. And so their clan now has a vote. Sorry, I call them a clan, but tribe now. So the Claudian tribe is one of the tribes. So when they have the vote by tribe, now one of the tribes that gets a vote is the Claudian tribe. That's how substantial this group of people leaving the Sabines and going to Romans. It wasn't just him with a few people, it was a good chunk of the population. Anyways, so they go, they join the Romans, they're granted citizenships with the nobles amongst them even being allowed into the patrician class. And Appius Claudius, he becomes a senator, he quickly works his way up from the Senate all the way to becoming a consul. And as a consul, he now leads the attack against the Sabines.
Wow.
So once he's consul, he says, no, we got to deal with these Sabines. They are trying to put together this big war effort. Basically, we got to get rid of them before they have a chance to get organized enough to deal with us. And they win such a decisive defeat that the Romans pretty much agree that it's going to be 5 years at least before the Sabines can even put the military up against us again. So Sabines, in their mind, completely neutralized for the next 5 years or so. That's how decisive the victory was, led by Appius Claudius. So Appius Claudius, winning a lot of renown in Rome, very much becoming loved amongst the patrician class. Shortly after that, Pupicola, we remember him? Pupicola? He was one of the 4 initial guys who helped establish Rome, along with Brutus, Collatinus, and Lucretius. He got the name, honorary name Pupicola, that's not what he was called at the time. He got the honorary name Pupicola as a friend of the people. He's the one that gave the people, the assembly, 2 laws. 1, they can kill anyone who tries to make himself a king. And 2, he gave the assembly the right of veto. That makes
First time I'm hearing that word.
the
Pupicola.
Pupicola, his name.
Have you ever used that? You guys?
We did. Coming back to, so Publius Valerius Pupicola.
Oh, Pupis.
And I'm not sure where I put, where he passed. Oh, here it is. Publius Valerius Pupicola now.
Oh.
And history refers to him as Pupicola. So that's his most common name now in history. And that's why he gets that name. Friend of the people is how he's known. Anyways, so when he dies, he unfortunately died in poverty, and so a bunch of the citizens gave some of their own money forward to give him some grand funeral. And there we go, there goes the last of the 4 founders of Rome, so to speak. They're now all dead.
The 4, meaning like
The 4 that were initially there with Lucretia.
Founders of the Republic.
Founders of the Republic, thank you. Not founders of Rome. That's Romulus.
Okay.
Good.
Okay, yeah. So they're only the ones that were there for Lucretia's
Yes, so
whole thing.
Brutus, Collatinus,
How is that
Pupicola,
possible that
and
he died in
Lucretius.
poverty when he was one of the most powerful people there for a while?
Lots of things can happen in life. I don't know how he died in poverty, but he died in poverty.
That's also happened. A lot of founding fathers of America died in poverty too. It's interesting.
Dedicate your life to something and put aside other things, I guess.
Yeah.
All right, so now 2 cities under Roman control, 2 Latin cities under Roman control, decide to rebel against the Latins. So Numidia and Cora. Cora is all the way down here. I'm not sure how the Latins had control of that city, but apparently they did. And then Numidia, unfortunately, we have no clue where exactly it was, but somewhere in this area. Okay, so these 2 cities decide to revolt against the Romans, and in revolting against the Romans, they turn to Aritzia, basically coming under Aritzia rather than Rome, so to speak. Now remember, Aritzia was the ones who just fought the Etruscans, and the Romans helped the Etruscans fighting Aritzia. So Aritzia and Rome have bad blood between them now. And so they betray Rome, they revolt against Rome, and they turn to Aritzia, which starts a war now between Rome and Aritzia together with Cora and then wherever Numidia is. I have no idea. Anyways, they fight a pitched battle somewhere out in the field, and the Romans end up winning that battle. And then the people, all 3 armies, they go to the city of Numidia. I'm going to make up a location. There it is. So they go to the city of Numidia, and now that's where they're taking refuge from the Romans. And now the Romans are forced to just try and siege it. They have to siege the city and basically try and starve them out, drawing out the conflict. And it is just a fierce little siege, lots of people dying back and forth. And they are just becoming more and more furious with each other as it draws out. It was a long siege. And finally, the people inside Numidia get so done with it, they all come charging out of the city to fight the Roman army, kind of unsuspectingly. And Livy says they were fighting so fiercely, and so much of the population was involved, that many of them didn't even have weapons and were coming out with torches. That's all they were using for a weapon. And so Rome is completely just overrun. They are absolutely savage to the Romans that they get. And just no one's being taken prisoner here. Anyone they get, they're killing, and they're not killing nicely. And so Rome is driven back in a humiliating defeat.
Wow.
Wow. Yeah.
And so, next military season, new consul in power, Rome re-gets its army, and they have one goal and one goal only: make Comitia pay. That time they siege the city. When they siege the city, they return the favor. First off, they siege the city, and Comitia actually ends up surrendering to them, because they realize there's no hope. And when they surrender to the Romans don't give them any safety for surrendering. And they end up going and killing all the leaders inside the cities. Anyone associated with the rebellion, they kill them. So it's absolutely devastating to them, and the city is largely looted. So they're making an example of Comitia. One, don't humiliate the Romans and let them live to tell the tale, because they'll come back to you. And two, you Latin towns, don't step out of line. So, setting the scene for the Latin Wars is what we're now starting. So Latin Wars go from roughly 501 BC to 496 BC.
That was the Latin Wars?
This is part of the Latin Wars.
So it's just getting started?
So that was a chunk of it. That was 2 years of it.
Okay.
Now, continuing with the Latin Wars. Okay, so we down. Now, what happens to the side? So you got the Latins becoming more and more irritated. They don't like the example that was just made of Comitia for one. On top of that, during some festival going on in Rome, when Rome does these festivals, even though they're constantly fighting these people are also their neighbors. And so they're also invited to festivals and stuff like that. And so, you can be at war with them one year, and then you can be a guest in their city the next. For those of you who know some Greek history, think kind of like Athens and Sparta. 1 year you're at war, your enemies, the next year you're celebrating together. And then the next year, back to fighting or whatever. So that's how it is in these relationships between them. So with the Sabines not being able to really fight the Romans at this time, they're invited to whatever festivals are going on in Rome. A bunch of Sabine guys go to this festival, and they decide to recreate the rape of the Sabine women, but backwards. So the Sabines, they decide to take a bunch of Roman girls. Now they kind of meant this jokingly, although the Romans didn't find it very funny with the Sabines running off. They weren't really going to take them and make them their wives and keep the women, but they just hauled off with them, kind of meant to be a joke. Now understand, we're already 250 years after the rape of the Sabine women. So you're like getting even for something that's way, way in the past. It'd be kind of like the British now taking some American tea company's tea and now going and dumping it in the harbor, saying, take that. Payback. So the Romans, they don't find it amusing. And when it actually happens, at least a fight breaking out between the Sabines and the Romans right there as it's happening. And on top of that, this becomes something that causes the Romans and the Sabines to actually go to war with each other.
Even though the Sabines aren't ready.
Even though the Sabines aren't ready, right? The Sabines didn't really want this war. Rome is punishing them for what was meant to be a joke, essentially. Joke taken too far. That's what Rome's punishing them for. So now war is declared between Rome and the Sabines, although no fighting is actually going on. Because the Sabines can't really fight, and Rome doesn't really want to go fight them. There's a reason Rome doesn't want to go fight them. And that is because they have gotten word that 30 Latin cities have united together under Tusculum over here with Tarquin. Tarquin hasn't just been sitting there twiddling his thumbs. He's been going to the Latin cities saying, you really want Rome to still be in control? You like what Rome's been doing here? And so been drumming up support. And so 30 Latin cities have all come together under Tusculum, ultimately for the purpose of taking Rome. So Rome gets word that this is what's going on, and this has them terrified. That's a big battle waiting to happen. And so Rome, in 501 BC, so those other things were only leading up to the Latin Wars. Sorry, Latin Wars technically start 501 BC. So Rome's, in 501 BC, they, for the first time, set up a dictator. First time the office has been used. And so Titus Lartius, whatever his name is, he gets set up as the first dictator. Now, for one, the Sabines, they're terrified. They understand what it means for Rome to have a dictator. They have close ties to the city of Rome, so they understand that this is a big deal. Rome must be serious. they think that the dictator was appointed on account of them. And so they are instantly trying to establish peace terms with Rome. Rome doesn't accept any of their peace terms, but the fact that they're trying to get peace means that Rome doesn't have to worry about them attacking. Rome's terms with them was something along the lines of, we'll forgive all the young men who were part of the event, but all the older men, you have to turn them over to us. The Sabines are like, that's ridiculous. It was a joke. Is there some other way we can negotiate? So the negotiations are going on, but the point is, the Sabines aren't attacking, they're terrified. And Rome knows now that they're not really going to attack since they're suing for peace so strongly. So they declared a dictator thinking that the Latins and the 30 Seas are getting ready to attack Rome, and so they've got to be ready to respond.
What's the definition of sue at this point? Like what are you meaning as?
When they sue for peace,
Yeah,
they, more than propose for it, they're almost begging for it.
right.
They're pushing for it as much as they can.
Okay. Yeah.
So yeah, propose, but in a more dramatic way. Okay, so they declared the dictator. Now, the dictatorship, remember, it's appointed for 6 months. So he's appointed dictator for 6 months. And after 6 months, the Latins did not attack. And after 6 months, Titus does something crazy. When his term expires as dictator, he gives the power back to the Senate and goes and takes his place as a private citizen once again. And we're going to see throughout the class dictators appointed over and over again. Every single dictator, all the way down to Julius Caesar, when their term expired, they just gave up the power, even though they had all the power of the state. Absolutely crazy. Not all the power of the state, but essentially. So he's appointed dictator. He has a 6 months as dictator. Nothing happens. And now Rome's back without a dictator. All right, any questions so far? Okay. Now,
Just because they thought they were going to be attacked?
yes. Yes, they got word that this was happening. They thought that it was about to happen. They thought it was it was basically on the verge of happening, so they were trying to make sure that they were ready. And whether the fact that they appointed a dictator, maybe they were getting ready, heard Rome had a dictator, and decided to put it off for whatever reason, we don't have that much detail into the thinking going on. But we do know that they don't end up attacking at this time. Now, fast forward 5 years to 496, and finally, this war that has been boiling forever, everyone knew it was eventually going to happen, it was just a matter of when, it finally ends up boiling over and happening. And so Rome ends up appointing their dictator, Aulus Postumius. So Postumius here ends up being appointed as their dictator, and he's the one that is now going to lead the Roman army to actually go and basically take the fight to them. And so the way I read it is that basically Rome's done waiting for this alliance to get organized enough to come fight us. We're going to take the battle to them.
So they waited 5 years, roughly?
5 years roughly.
And, okay, so there's 30 land cities. They all are going to unite against Rome.
Yes, so
And
they
wait,
agreed upon some treaty that they're all going to unite against Rome.
but none of them actually do anything for 5 years.
Well, they could have been doing things, and there could have been internal politicking about who's going to be the leader of what and how many troops you're going to contribute. And your city's only contributing 5,000, mine's doing 7,000. Why can't you match?
Sounds like they really didn't want to fight.
Well, I'm making up what is common things that you read about when you read about other conflicts.
Yeah, I'm just saying the fact that they wait 5 years is all.
Yeah, so it's strange that they waited as long as they did, maybe. I don't know, maybe it's normal. Maybe 5 years when we're talking about these types of battles isn't that big of a deal.
Okay.
So, whatever ends up happening, the Romans end up taking the fight to Tusculum, and along the way, they had their battle. It's called the Battle of Lake Regillus, and Lake Regillus is some lake somewhere in Tusculum territory. So, not positive
So
where
it's
that
not
lake
one
is.
of
For
the ones-
some reason, this map has it marked up there, but it's very much supposed to be in the Tusculum territory, which is right here.
That's very weird.
So I think it's a mess up on the map. That, or for some reason, Tusculum had control of the territory there.
Which is strange, yeah.
Which, yeah, doesn't make sense to me. And so this battle, when you're reading about this battle, it's almost like reading one of Homer's tales about a battle. And it is a very fierce battle. there has been a lot of bad blood between the Romans and the Latins going all the way back to Rome and its first founding and its fights with Alba Longa. And so there's a lot of bad blood, and there's one word to describe this battle, and that battle is fierce. It is absolutely fierce. And so the way the battle ends up working, Romans coming from the top, and then they have, so this would be all their infantry, and then they have their cavalry going down on some road, the lake's somewhere to the side, and then you've got the enemy's infantry together with their cavalry. Once again, the cavalry are the first ones to meet each other wherever the battlefield's happening, and they can't even wait. They instantly just charge in and start fighting each other. Once the leader of this cavalry sees the leader of that cavalry, these guys, they hate each other. They've known each other forever. They hate each other. The second they see each other, they want to be the one to quickly get the victory and kill each other. And so, as these armies meet up with each other, you have similar things happening with leaders on both sides when they see each other, just taking whoever they have around them and just charging at that guy, trying to kill that guy. And in this battle, pretty much every major leader on both sides ends up dead or injured from the fighting. The only major leader who comes out of this battle unharmed is the actual dictator, Postumius. And it's because he's operating things from behind the lines largely. But so the way that Levy tells the story, it's like reading one of Homer's tales where one hero charges at another hero and gets his revenge, but then the other guy comes after him, back and forth, and the army is swaying back and forth as the fighting is going on. Major points when the fighting is actually going on. So you got that army here. Once the major fighting is going on, the cavalry largely disengage with each other, and also because their leaders have both died of the cavalry. So you got the major infantry here, fighting the major infantry here. Their cavalry is pretty much out of the fighting now, and these guys' cavalry is pretty much out of the fighting now, both having taken some pretty serious losses. Now the infantry are fighting, and they're just going to be guarding each other's flanks. There's a lot of back and forth in the fighting with one side gaining the advantage over the other. The dictator, he's sitting back here with his personal cohort, his personal bodyguard, so to speak. At one of the times, when it seems like the Latins are going to win the war, he tells his cohort very loudly, any Roman you see fleeing the battlefield, treat him like an enemy, kill him. And so he sends his cohort basically behind the Romans, ready to kill anyone trying to leave. Now, there comes a point where on one of the flanks, I don't know which side, they start losing, and then he sends his cohort in to help hold up that side. And then he finally goes over to the cavalry, and he tells them they need to dismount, and they need to go charge in. Now understand, your cavalry is largely composed of your patricians. These are your elites. These are your nobles. There's a reason that they're on the cavalry, not only because it's expensive, but it's also the safest place to be. Odds of dying, not as good. When they finally get off their cavalry and charge into the battle, that lifts up the Roman spirits enough that they then swing the tide of the battle and end up winning the entire battle. With that, the Latins are now forced to retreat. Our dictator here was ready. He had some infantry hurry up, gather up the horses, get them back down to the guys who are cavalry, who are trained to use the horses, and have them charge down the enemy. This is a massive, decisive victory for the Romans over the Latins. They win a huge defeat. The Latins suffer huge casualties, and thousands of them are taken prisoner after the fact. And so with that, Rome has pretty much re-established itself as head of the Latins where they were before they overthrew Tarquin. So Tarquin came to power over the Latins, and then Rome had to restart again when they drove Tarquin out. Now they're pretty much head of the Latins again after this battle, you could say, with a very decisive victory. In the battle, I told you pretty much anyone died or got injured. Octavius here, Tarquin's son-in-law, is one of the people who died, the leader of the city of Tusculum. And Tarquin himself got injured in the fighting. And so now,
It's about time.
about time, yeah. This guy's been going on for a while. And I think his last son may have died in this battle. I think he ends up losing all three of his sons, and he loses his son-in-law, trying to get back Rome. Anyway, so very fierce battle. Tons of very important people end up dying in the battle. And Rome ends up winning a decisive victory. Rome is now the head of the Latins, or largely seen as the head of the Latins. Now, even though Tarquin died, he still escapes and he runs off to Cumae. I'm not sure which of those dots it's supposed to be, probably that one. Some Greek city-state, it's the same Greek city-state that helped the Arutians against the Etruscans. Those were the Greek, I said mercenaries, but I'm not sure if they were. That came in out. They were from that city-state. So that is now where Tarquin is. And he dies, I think, of his wounds. Not sure if it's of his wounds, but he dies shortly after the fact. 495 BC, that's the end of Tarquin. Rome can now finally breathe. They don't have this guy constantly trying to come up with a plan to attack them. So that's the end of Tarquin. Any questions with that before we continue? Now, remember that the Romans brought the fight to the Latins. It wasn't that they waited for the Latins to finish getting united and come attack the Romans. So the Romans brought the fight to the Latins. Well, the Volsci, see if we have a map for the Volsci. So the Volsci are down here. Latins would be these red ones. Here's Tusculum, there's Rome. So the Volsci, they're blue down here. So that's what we mean by the Volsci. The Volsci, or the Volscians, the people from Volsci, the Volscians, they had agreed to help the Latins in the war. And they had already started gathering up their troops, getting ready to send them up to the Latins. So it wouldn't have just been the 30 Latins fighting Rome. The Latins were also getting help from the surrounding peoples as well to get them to send troops. And because of how quickly Rome decided to come down and attack, the Volscians were never able to actually send their troops to help the Latins. So Rome knows that they were getting ready to help the Latins, and it's probably what drove Rome ultimately to bring the fight to the Latins. And so once Rome beats the Latins, they instantly take their army and they march down into the Volsci territory. Now the Volscians are absolutely terrified. They were supposed to be on the overwhelming side that was going to easily beat Rome. Now Rome has already beat the guys that they were teaming up with and has their army already in Volscian territory. So they're absolutely terrified, and they instantly sue for peace with the Romans. So what Rome says is, give us 300 hostages and we'll be on our way. And then obviously you can kill the hostages should the Volsci ever act out against you again. So the Volsci, being very alarmed, they quickly agree to that. Now, Hernici is purple up here. So they're not as big as the Volsci, but they're right next to the Volsci. Good? So we can go back. Okay, so now, the Volsci, they kind of just agreed to peace simply because Rome caught them so off guard. Suddenly the army was there. They're not really going to let all these war preparations go to waste. They've been getting ready this whole time. And so, they get with the Hernici, the guys right next to them, and they decide, we're going to go to war with the Romans. Let's continue with the plan that we already had. We'll get the Latins involved again, and we'll all go to war together against the Romans. Let's continue with the plan that we had. It's just Rome attacked too quick. Let's try again. That's essentially what they were. And so they start sending ambassadors. I'm trying to say both at the same time. We'll say ambassadors. They start to send ambassadors to the Latin cities saying, hey, let's continue with the plan that we had before. Let's try this again. And the Latins, they have no appetite for this. Their losses at the Battle of Lake Regulus or whatever it was were devastating to them. The second that these ambassadors show up trying to get them to go to war against Rome again, they say not having it. They take them as prisoners and they take them to Rome. And they say, here's what they're trying to get us to do. You deal with it. And so the Romans, they let the ambassadors go. But now the Romans are informed about what the Volsci and what Hernici are trying to do against them. And on top of that, they give back the Latins a bunch of the slaves that they had taken in that battle. And they say, here you go, you can have your slaves back. And on top of that, they renegotiate more favorable treaty conditions that are much kinder to the Latins. Because the Latins are now showing a lot of good faith. And so, this, oddly, brings the Latins and the Romans very close together. Because these slaves who were stuck in Rome were actually treated extremely well to the houses that they basically have to serve. You know, you're taken as a slave in war, you're basically forced to serve in some house. The households that they were forced to serve in treated them so well that they end up creating these bonds with all these Latin cities everywhere that the slaves went. And since these slaves were drawn from so many different cities, it creates these bonds of friendships with so many different cities. And so you get back and forth, like now that you're friends with each other, know each other, visiting like each other's cities. And so a Roman would go stay in some Latin city with that guy that was once a slave. And he'd spend a month with him, and they'd come visit sometime in the Roman city. And so this back and forth is creating a very close connection of camaraderie between now the Romans and the Latins, oddly enough. And then, since the Volsci know that Rome has gotten word that they were preparing to go to war with them, they decide that now is not a good time to go to war with them.
But Rome still has the Volsci hostages.
Probably killed them. I have no idea. It obviously wasn't stopping the Volsci from getting ready to go to war,
Yeah.
which is what the point of the hostages is.
Okay.
So I don't know what happened with those 300 hostages, but I would guess they were killed. No clue. Now, while Tarquin was alive, the Senate was very much worried about the people wanting Tarquin back as a king to save them from all the hardship that they had to deal with fighting for Rome to stay independent. So the Senate and the patricians up to this point had been very kind to the plebeians, the masses. The nobles were being very kind to the masses. Anytime some major expenditure came along, largely the patricians took it on themselves, trying to keep the plebs happy. Once Tarquin dies, they kind of think, not really a point of being so nice to these guys anymore. And we can start taking advantage of them. And so with the death of Tarquin, the Senate and the patricians start very much oppressing the people. And one of the major ways that they do this is through debt. Loans at this time and debt at this time. We need to talk a little bit about it. It is not unusual. Going back to these ancient city-states, forget Rome, but a bunch of ancient city-states, including Rome, to charge interest rates as high as 100% and even higher. In fact, when we fast forward like a few more decades, we're going to get to something called the 12 tables that have a bunch of laws on them. One of the laws Rome has to pass in the future is you can't charge more than 100% interest rate. So I give you a sense for what kind of debts these people were taking on.
That is insane.
It's absolutely insane. So you would come across some hard time, and then you would be forced to take out a loan to deal with it in the short term. And the interest of the loan would be impossible a bunch of times for you to ever overcome. I'll make up an example, but just to give you a sense of it. Say that you're some Roman farmer, and you have a bad year. And so you need to borrow, we'll say $10,000, 10,000 asses, whatever, 10,000 of some unit, to keep your farm afloat. Well, if you're doing that at 100% interest, well, the next year, you're going to owe 20,000. But let's say you had 2 years, bad years back to back. And so you have to borrow another 10,000. Well, then after the second year, you're going to owe $30,000 or whatever. Let's say the next year, you have a really good harvest, and you have $40,000 ready to put down towards your debt. Well, you owe $60,000, but you're able to pay off $40,000 because you had a fantastic year, and so you still owe $20,000 of debt. So even though you paid off double what you borrowed, you still owe as much as you borrowed. And so these massive...
Twice as much as you borrowed.
Well, no,
No,
because they borrowed 10,000, borrowed 10,000 in the scenario I made up.
Right.
And so you can see how these massive interest rates can get almost impossible to get out from under. And what's worse is debt is often transition. If your father owes a big debt, you could end up responsible for that debt. So it's not tied to a particular person necessarily. Or you could be locked up in prison because your father owes such a big debt. So it gets tied to the families. And so your dad takes out one loan one time, and it can be you that ends up having to pay it off for the rest of your life. And it doesn't take too much for it to get to a point where even if you're having great years, you're barely taking care of the interest. And the second you have a bad year, what are you now forced to do? If you can't get your farm to produce enough to pay off your loan,
If you take out
well, you take out another loan. You can't do that because already your max income, the best you could hope to do. So imagine that you now get to the point where you owe $40,000. The most you can hope your farm could ever produce in a year is $40,000. So it can barely keep up with the interest. The only other option you have is to sell your farm and to try and get rid of the debt that way. And so in this way, in a bunch of city-states, this is a tactic used so that the wealth that was distributed amongst the masses slowly consolidates in the hands of a few. So not talking about Rome now, but just talking about city-states that this would happen in a lot of times. This is how you would get these cycles. What would happen is you have these rich elite charging these insane interest rates, basically gathering all the wealth, all the farmland is what typically came down to, all the farmland in the area coming under the control of just a few people. And they get to the point where the whole population, once you can't pay off your debt and you don't have any property, what would typically happen to you is you're basically forced into servitude to work off your loan, even though it's impossible throughout your life to work off your loan. So you're basically a slave for all intents and purposes. So the population would essentially become slaves to a few very wealthy people. What would typically happen in that scenario is some hero amongst the people, some hero of the people would say, look how much we outnumber them. Let's unite together, make me your leader, give me a bodyguard, and I will drive them out of the city, and we'll take the wealth and redistribute it. And this is how tyrants typically came to power. So the people unite behind one man, he gets his bodyguard, they would kill off the elites, take their wealth, redistribute it amongst the people. And so then you have a tyrant in power. And then what would happen when you get a tyrant in power? Eventually they start abusing their power, and they're ruling through fear, and they're ruling through force. And so eventually the people get sick of that, and they usually turn to the nobles, the elites, the wealthier people in their society, and join with them to overthrow the tyrant. And repeat. And so those cycles, it was very normal to see that type of cycle happen over and over again in some city-states. With some different government types, but it gives you the taste of it. We already kind of saw this with Rome. Tarquin, being a tyrant, ruling Rome, what did the people do? They turned to the patricians, the elites, Brutus, Collatinus, Publicola, and used them to overthrow the tyrant. And now what are we seeing? The second part of that. Now they're going to start collecting a bunch of money through debts. So that's how this debt is working at this time, and how it's just killing them.
And that's just 100%, if they're doing more than 100%.
Right. And just to give you a taste for 100% interest rate, even just over a generation. Imagine you borrow $1 from me at 100% interest, and we'll only compound it annually. How much do you owe me after 1 year? $2. How much do you owe me after 2 years? $4. That's nothing. How much do you owe me after 10 years? After 10 years, you owe me $1,024.
Yeah.
After 20 years, you owe me $1 million. After 30 years, you owe me $1 billion. You borrow $1, 30 years later, you owe me $1 billion. Your dad gets in a tough spot, takes out a little loan. 30 years later, a generation later, you and your family are now slaves to me. Thank you very much. So, insane interest rates. And so debt is a very real problem in all these early city-states. Rome is no exception. And you're going to see how Rome is teetering on the edge of tipping over, and the patricians basically losing all power. And if that happened, obviously Rome would be Rome. So they're going to be an exception. But you'll see how everything leans that way. So anyways, debt is becoming a major issue now for the plebs in Rome. The senators, they're no longer taking on the financial responsibility themselves. They're now going to be charging the interest rate that they can charge, and they're going to start cultivating wealth for themselves. The plebs start to complain that they have more freedom in war with the enemy than they now have in peace. So a bunch of these guys, they're losing everything that they own, they're losing their lands, they're losing their wealth, and they're becoming slaves to patricians. And they're saying, I have it worse here as a slave to my fellow citizens than I had it as a prisoner of war as a soldier. Yeah, horrendous conditions for a bunch of these guys. And so that's what's going on. And the story of an old man kind of becomes a tipping point for him. So what happens is they're in the public forum. An old man comes into the forum, and he's recognized by a bunch of people there. He used to be a great centurion in the army. And instead, he's very disheveled. It's obvious that he's very poor. His body has been very badly beaten. And so people start to ask him, what on earth happened? What's going on? You were a great centurion not that long ago. What's happened? And so he explains what happened. Now remember, Rome does their census every 5 years. The census determines how much you pay in taxes. So here he was, a well-to-do man. Since he's a centurion, he was probably a first-class citizen in Rome. That kind of wealth. And so the census is done, it's declared that he's a first-class citizen, so he has that position in the military. But that means that when tax season comes, he's going to owe a lot, because the taxes are disproportionate to how much wealth you have. Now, while he was a centurion, off fighting in the war, his farm happened to be on the northern side of Rome, closer to where the Sabine territory is. And in the Sabine raids, his fields got destroyed, his home got burned down, his cattle got driven off. He essentially lost everything he had while he was off fighting some other battle. Nothing he could do about it. So when he came home to all that destruction and had pretty much nothing left, he was then required to pay his war tax. He had absolutely nothing to pay his war tax with. And so he had to borrow money to pay his war tax. And then the interest on the loan was accumulating faster than he could pay it off doing any sort of work. So he lost all his land to his creditor, and he lost, I think, his father's or his son's land, I can't remember which way it went, to his creditor as well, until he was completely broke. And then his creditor took him and put him in forced servitude, and on top of that, if you didn't pay it, your creditor could also physically punish you, have you whipped. And so he had just had his back nice and whipped when he entered the forum. And so people could see that he had scars on his front from his great deeds in battle, and scars on his back from his fellow citizen. And so, as he comes forward with his story, other people have similar stories for what happened to them who are in similar conditions, a similar boat to him. And so the mob just becomes absolutely outraged as they're finding out more and more how common this is. And so you get a mob forming up there, centered downtown Rome. And so the mob, quickly gathering whatever senators they can around him, forcing them into the Senate house. The consuls come to see what's going on. The mob grabs the consuls, forces them into the Senate house, and say, you need to do something about this. This issue has to be solved. And so there they are, forcing whoever they can into the Senate house. The problem is that the Senate can't technically do anything without 60% of the senators present or something like that. Some rule. So the mob's sitting here telling them that they need to hurry up and do something, and the Senate's not doing anything. The senators inside the Senate house call for senators from their private houses that they need to come to the Senate house so that we can meet because this mob's going crazy. Senators in their private homes think this might be a ploy. They know that there's a mob in the city and they're afraid that, it's rebellion time. It's going to cost them their lives. So they're dragging their feet even going to the Senate house, which is just making the mob angry and angrier. Eventually the senators outside in their private homes decide that they're just as safe in the Senate house as they're in their private homes. If they're going to kill them, they're going to kill them. So they end up going to the Senate house to start meeting to decide what to do about this mob and this debt problem that's now become a real problem for them. Now, Appius Claudius, remember the guy that ultimately came from the Sabines, the guy that recommended peace with Rome, we're going to see that he hates the plebs. So Appius, being one of their more renowned senators now, he's been consul at least once, I don't know how many times he was consul, he basically recommends violence against these plebs. He says something to the effect of, there's no conviction here, there's just complaining. And if we go out there with a show of force, we whip the few, we beat the few who are causing the problem, they'll all disperse and that will be the end of it. So that's what he's pushing for. Oh, I think he's actual consul at this time. So, second consulship for him. Servilius, another consul at the time, he's recommending moderation. He's saying, no, that's a bad idea. All you're going to do is work him up more. You're going to get us killed. This is a terrible idea. So here they are debating what to do about this debt problem. While they're debating what to do about the debt problem, a man on horseback comes riding into the Senate screaming, basically like Paul Revere, that the Volsci are coming, the Volsci are coming. So, the Volsci have finally decided to march on Rome. Remember, they've been making these war preparations for a long time. So now they've decided to march on Rome. And the plebeians, they instantly celebrate, while the patricians are terrified. Why are the plebeians celebrating? They're saying it's better we all die together than us plebeians suffer alone. So they say none of us are going to basically enlist ourselves in the army. We're not going to fight, so good luck to you. Well, that puts Rome in a bad spot because the plebeians are the majority of their population. I think I took the time to do it here. Just give you a taste for estimates of the Roman demographics at the time. So looking at Roman demographics at the time, the total population of Rome and her surrounding territory is going to be roughly 100 to 150,000 people. with those that are citizens being estimated at 30 to 50,000 people. Remember, your citizens are going to be your adult males. So children aren't citizens, and women aren't citizens, and then foreigners wouldn't be considered citizens.
We're like slaves.
And slaves aren't citizens. Slaves are going to be a very minute portion of the population at this time.
Okay.
Almost non-existent. Now, of which, the estimates are 5 to 10% of the population are patricians. So, 2 to 5,000 people, 5,000 max is your patrician number. Probably a reasonable guesstimate would be about 3,000 of them, which is nothing for an army. The rest of them, 25 to 45,000 of them, are going to be your plebeians, making up the majority of your military. So when you look at your military-age citizens, it's going to be 20 to 30,000. With the army that they typically have, it's roughly 20,000 infantry with 1,800 cavalry, and your patricians are usually all in this class.
Yeah.
Remember where the fighting takes place? It's largely amongst the phalanxes. So your plebeians pretty much did the bulk of the fighting, even though patricians were technically there. So the plebeians refused to sign up for war, saying the patricians should serve as soldiers, meaning actual infantry rather than just being on the cavalry. Patricians should serve as soldiers, that the patricians should take up arms, so that the perils of war should remain with those with whom the advantages were. The patricians are sitting here benefiting from these wars. Every time there's new lands and stuff like that, the patricians are benefiting from that. So maybe they should be the ones to carry on the risks of war as well, rather than lose everything while they're out fighting a battle and be stuck with endless debt. So, what are the senators going to do in this position where the plebeians refuse to sign up for war? They're definitely not going to send out Appius Claudius to deal with them, who just wants to go beat them all until they say okay. And instead they send out the consul Servilius, the more moderate of the two. And they say, we need you to go talk to the plebs and get them to agree to take up arms to go fight the Volsci, because we're in trouble.
Does this land in his month or whatever, or is it?
I don't know.
They're just like doing it.
It's not one of them holding fasces. It's the Senate giving the consuls direction, what they want them to do. Now, it's just a recommendation. The consuls don't have to listen. But remember, everyone listens to the Senate. It's the most powerful institution with no power. Okay, so the consul Servilius is the one who goes out and meets with the plebeians and convinces them to sign up. Now, the way that he convinces them is he says, first of all, you don't want some law to be quickly passed while we're all afraid for our lives. All that's going to happen is make the patricians resent you. And the second that this risk is over, they'll do whatever they can to get back at you for forcing them to agree to some law that they didn't really want to agree to. So this is a bad idea. It sets a bad precedent. You shouldn't want this. Second, there's something dishonorable about Rome fighting with herself when there's an external enemy. The proper thing to do now, the honorable thing to do now, is to first deal with the external enemy and then deal with our own internal problems. He says, now I as consul will make sure that this problem is taken care of, and I'll make sure that this debt problem, we address it after the war is over. On top of that, he quickly helps to pass a law that exceptions are made for any plebeian who signs up for war. Any plebeian who signs up for war, they cannot be taken prisoner for not paying their debts. So anyone who's already a prisoner due to your debt, if you agree to sign up, your creditor can't legally hold you prisoner. 2, none of your property can be seized while you're serving. So they can't just go seize your property. 3, none of your family can be enslaved while you're serving. So while you're a soldier in my army, it will be essentially like you don't have any debt. And then we'll deal with it after the fact. That's what he promises to the people.
But he doesn't get rid of their debt. He just says, we're not going to make it
Right, we're not going to pass a law to deal with the debt. We'll pass a law that makes it pretend like the debt doesn't exist while we deal with the war. And then we'll come back and deal with the issue after the war. And so the plebeians, they think that's pretty good. I mean, a consul, you're not going to get a higher person in Rome on your side, right? That's the highest position. If he says that he'll help us with this, then all right, we'll sign up for the military, we'll allow ourselves to be levied, and we will go fight.
Isn't he a consul for only like a year?
Yes, consul for a year, but it's going to be just a quick battle.
Okay.
So the plebeians agreed to sign up to the military. He takes the military out, he encamps them, and so they're encamped somewhere out in the field, and the Volsci, they're in their camp. Now remember, the Volsci are very aware of what's going on in Rome, and they know that there's a lot of internal conflict. So the first thing they basically do is send some people over there to say, hey, you want to just let us in the camp? And we'll kill those pesky patricians for you, type thing. Which, that doesn't work. So they initially tried to just win the war with treachery. That doesn't work. The Romans aren't going to give up that easily. And so the Volsci, I think that they somewhat outnumber them in this battle. They instead just decide to attack the Roman camp rather than waiting for the Romans to line up. Now the Romans were hiding in their camp the whole time. They weren't coming out and lining up on the field like you normally would to get ready to fight. Servilius, he's forcing the Romans to wait inside their camp because he's kind of nervous. He's not sure what's going to happen when these Romans get out there. He knows that they're discontented. He doesn't want to take an army out there that's only going to fight half-heartedly and then run away. So he's holding them inside the camp, not sure what to do. He doesn't feel good about going out and starting to fight. The Volsci get tired of waiting. They decide they're going to take the fight to the Roman camp rather than doing it out in the field. And so they finally start attacking the Roman camp, swing up their army, attacking from all the sides, whatever they're doing. And even with the Roman camp being attacked and them having to repel them off the walls, Servilius still kind of waits, and he's not letting the army counterattack yet. And he waits until the Volsci basically become overconfident, and he's convinced that the Romans are so eager to finally fight that he finally gives the order, and the Romans just charge out. And so the Volsci are kind of shocked by that, because they've been behaving this whole time like they're terrified of the Volsci, when in reality it's because of orders that they haven't been fighting back. So they suddenly fight back. They're able to quickly push the Volsci back. And the Volsci, they retreat all the way to a city named Suessa, which is some rich Volscian town. And so with that retreat, Rome obviously follows them all the way back to the city. They're able to quickly take the city themselves. And since it was such a rich town, what Servilius does, the consul, is he allows his army to plunder the town. And why is he letting his army plunder the town? To help relieve them of some of their debt to come. So in some small part, he's already making good on his promise to these guys to help them deal with their debt. So this Volsci town gets raided, gets plundered. The soldiers, they enrich themselves. The Volsci quickly sue for peace. They're forced to give up some land in the peace talks that follow. And so there go the Volsci. Maybe help if we had just a quick map of where all these guys were. Suessa Pomedia, wherever that city was, I don't know, some Volscian town. Now, this map doesn't show all the way up like I want. Come on, where is it? No? I have a particular map in mind. Don't let me lose track of which slide I'm on. Here's the map I want. It was just down one. Okay. So they're down here fighting the Volsci, some town, and they end up winning the battle there against the Volsci. Next, what ends up happening, this map doesn't show the Annoy River. The Annoy River is somewhere like right here. It's not the one I was looking for, sorry. The Annoy River is somewhere like right here. What ends up happening next is, since the Romans are supposed to be down in this drawn-out battle against the Volsci, the Sabines decide that that's a good time to attack. And so they cross the Annoy River, and they start plundering just like rich country-type homes. Homes that would be owned by the patrician-type class. So they gather up a bunch of loot crossing over here, thinking that the army is really, really far away, nothing to worry about. And they're so unworried about it that they're not taking their loot and quickly leaving. They're eating the food, they're drinking the wine, they're enjoying themselves. So they're coming down, they're looting, and they're having a good time, thinking that the army is far off. And so Rome wins a quick battle against the Volsci. Now the Sabines who cross the Annoy as they're plundering, what the Romans do, because their army is a ways away, is they quickly send the cavalry with the guy who was the last dictator, Postumius. He's not a consul, but he's a past consul and he's a past dictator. So he's high enough that they're okay giving him this charge. They send all the cavalry with him to just charge up to the Annoy River as fast as they can. So you got the Annoy River up here, whatever, and you got the Sabines down here, looting, plundering, drinking, having a good time. They send the cavalry up as fast as they can, basically just to harass them and tie them down, while the military marches its way up there. And this works. So they tie him down. It's about one night's march, and in that same night, so during the day they came, they crossed, they started eating and drinking. That same night is when the battle happens, and they're able to defeat the Sabine army in a single day. Now, the Aruntians, again, another one that they fought a bunch of times, they also think that now is a good time to attack Rome because they know there's this other problem on this frontier. And so what they do is they say, Rome, we want you to withdraw all of the people that you have in the Volsci territory, or else we're going to go to war with you. And what they do is they send their ambassadors out and their army right behind them. So when the ambassadors show up to Rome saying, you have to agree to withdraw all your troops from this territory, otherwise we're going to attack you, the army was already on the march. The senators had no time to even consider the proposition. And so all they're able to do is quickly tell the consul, send word to the consul, hey, that army's on the march. And so they're not even able to consider the offer, negotiate it. The army catches up to the other one. They're able to beat him in a single battle, and there it goes. And so another battle, another war and battle is won in a single day.
So how many years does it take for those three?
This 3 is not years.
3 days.
This 3 is, I'm not sure how long they went on with the Volsci. They were probably in camps for a couple weeks.
That's true.
But then after they beat the Volsci, the same day, they went up and they beat the Sabines. And then the next day, they're now catching the Aruntians on their way to Rome.
That's 3 wars.
So
Wars in a few weeks.
this army has just won 3 wars, and 2 of them, if not all 3 of them, in pretty outstanding fashion. Rome hardly took any casualties, and they got some pretty devastating defeats. They forced their enemies to suffer some pretty devastating losses.
They're pretty battle hardened around this time.
They're pretty battle hard.
And
That's
not only
you
that,
can always say that about the Romans.
but the morale is, it seems like the morale would be a problem, but it looks like it wasn't.
No, because early on, their first victory, a bunch of those soldiers, they got some money.
Oh, that's right.
So the soldiers are in a pretty good mood. And back-to-back battles, them taking hardly any casualties and winning, they're going to feel pretty good about that. And so here they go. They got the consul to agree that they'll deal with this debt problem. On top of that, he's already done good to help them deal with the debt problem. On top of that, they just won 2 other great victories for Rome. So now the soldiers are feeling pretty good as they're marching back to Rome. And Appius Claudius, the other consul, the one who despises the plebs, when Servilius gets back with the army, blocks any attempt Servilius makes at debt relief. Remember, a consul can veto another consul. And on top of that, when the problem is dealt with, even a bunch of the patricians instantly turn against Servilius and accuse him of trying to become popular with the plebs. They view him as kind of a weak man who was just trying to gain popularity amongst the plebs, and that's why he did all this debt relief stuff. And Appius Claudius and the patricians pushed even harsher terms on these guys with debt than what they had before. And so these soldiers, as they get back home, not only are they instantly put back into slaves, the ones who were in slaves, but new soldiers found themselves now slaves due to whatever the debt laws were.
That's ridiculous.
And so the plebeians, you can see that their morale just flipped to 180.
So, okay. No, I'll continue. I'm just reading the last part of the sentence. Servilius hated by the plebs and the patricians?
Yeah, so the soldiers are handed back to their creditors. Poor Servilius now, he's hated by the plebs because the plebs see him as walking back on his promise to them. He promised that he would do these things to help get rid of their debt. They come back to conditions worse than what they left in. And the patricians hate him because they see him as trying to win favor with the plebs. And so he's a man without a party, so to speak. On the other hand, Appius Claudius, he's despised by the plebs, but who cares about that? The patricians love him. So he keeps a good reputation amongst the patricians. Go ahead.
Why didn't all the spoils of war pay for their debts? Isn't that why they did
With
that?
how much their debts would have been, it helped relieve some of the debt. And maybe for some soldiers, it was enough to pay off their debt. But no, the debts that they're accumulating that have cost them all their living aren't something that's going to be quickly paid off
The interest,
with what you can haul from a city.
the interest rates were over.
That's what it is.
Yes, very high interest rates. Okay, so now, what do you do as a plebeian? You got a consul to agree to help you with this debt problem. He didn't even do anything about it. You went and you fought like you were supposed to. That didn't help do anything about it. And so what ends up starting to happen amongst plebeians is these people who are now in debt, when their creditors come after them, they basically run into the forum, run into the public areas, asking the people to protect them against their creditors, essentially. And so the people end up protecting debtors. And so it would be that if you were some senator trying to get this guy to pay a debt, 3 other guys might come around you and start pushing you around a little bit. And so it came to violence for a lot of these guys coming after debtors. They would actually get physically injured. Some senators got a good punch to the face or whatever happened to them. So things are starting to get violent. And now they start ignoring consuls' decrees. Here's the big one. So a consul would say that you have to do something. You have to give him up or whatever. You have to come pay your debt or whatever. They start ignoring consuls' decrees. Why do they feel comfortable doing that? The reason they feel comfortable doing that is because the assembly is given the right of veto, which is also the right of appeal. So now they can't really be found guilty of anything. So imagine I'm a plebeian, and you as a consul charge me of something. I say, no, I'm innocent. Who decides ultimately if I'm innocent? The people. And the people are all on my side. And so what ends up happening is all the plebs are basically appealing any decision that a magistrate is making against one of the people. And so they start ignoring even consuls' decrees, and they all refuse to sign up now for military service again. Obviously. So this is a big one. And when they start doing this, well, it's hard to know which of these two are bigger. They start doing 2 things that have Rome very disturbed. One is they won't sign up for the military, which puts Rome in a very precarious position because they're surrounded by enemies. And the other one that starts happening is these guys start meeting in secret, in their own meetings, just the plebeians, all over the place in secret. And so the senators are complaining that Rome doesn't have 1 senate, it has 100 senates. And people are deciding in all sorts of different places what the laws ought to be and how things ought to be in the city. And so it's becoming a very much disunited city. And so the previous consuls, they come and go. New consuls are now come to power. And what's one of the first things that these new consuls are told to do by the Senate? They see you need to levy an army. You need to go out there and get people to give their names and take the military oath to go serve in our military in case an enemy attacks. That's the first thing that we need to have done. And so some consuls, they now come to the consulship, and that's what the Senate tells them to do. And they go out to the people, and they tell the people, hey, you, you have to give your name up to be levied in our army. You have to put your name forward and take the military oath to be in the army. And the guy refuses. What does the consul do? Well, they send their lictor over there to beat him into submission, essentially. And then the other plebs stop the lictor from going over there. And so the consuls realize this is going to come to violence. There's no way around it. So they go back to the Senate and they say, are you sure? You want me to levy the army? That's what you want to do? And the younger and more hot-headed senators around him instantly start accusing him of being cowards. They say, if you're not willing to be the consul, step down from the position and we'll put people in power who will. And the consuls say, look, I'll try and force this if you want. Just wanted to make sure that's what you wanted because this is going to come to violence. He says, I notice that none of you are out there with me when we're trying to levy the armies. Those of you who dare and who aren't cowards, come with us at the very least. So we're warning you that this is going to come to violence, and now come and we'll show you that it's going to come to violence. So some of the senators, hot-headed, decide to go out there with the 2 consuls. And the 2 consuls, when they go out there, they intentionally pick someone that they know from previous experience is going to absolutely refuse them outright. And so they say, you, come give your name. And he refuses, and all the senators there instantly see. And the guy says, okay, lector, go beat him into submission and force him to give his name. As the lector's going over there, the senators see that the lector's physically stopped. Some of the hot-headed senators, they get angry at that, and they go try grabbing the plebs off of the lector, who they're physically trying to stop, which leads to brawling breaking out, and fights breaking out. And so now these senators are seeing firsthand how this is going to go. And so with that, they're kind of forced to let the issue go and go back in the Senate House. So on top of that, the Senates can't levy the army. Any legislation they try to come up with to try and put laws in place to solve the problem, the Assembly keeps vetoing. Remember, they're given the power of veto from Pubukola. So they can't go out and enforce anything. They can't pass laws to do anything. They're pretty much in a deadlock. There's nothing that the Roman government can really do at this point. And so here they are in the Senate House debating what to do about the issue. And there's three major ideas as to what they should do. So the Senate split through it. One position is that they should forgive the debt of just the soldiers that just went out and fought. The ones who just went out and fought, that's what Servilius promised them. Let's just fulfill his promises to those select soldiers. And that will help resolve this issue. Others say, you're just going to split them and they'll just be, a bunch of them will become angry that they didn't get a benefit that someone else got, so to speak. They think that'll just aggravate the issue, and they push for basically universal forgiveness of debt. Now, these two positions both terrify the Senate because they don't like setting this precedent. You get a bunch of debt, just get forgiven. They don't want to create that cycle of just forgiving debt anytime it's accumulated. So they're afraid of the precedent that's going to. Now, Appius Claudius, the lover of the plebs, what he says is, look, the problem here is that the plebs have the power of appeal. Anytime we say that we're going to punish them, then they can just appeal that decision and be found not guilty. We have a position that there's no appeal against, and it's called a dictator. Appoint me dictator, and now there's no appeal against anything I say. And let's see how brave they are to say no when they know that I can have them legally beaten, if not legally take their lives. Well, all the senators agree that's a pretty extreme position. This is a bad idea. We should definitely not go with Appius Claudius's decision.
Isn't he already, he already finished his, being consul?
Yes, he's been consul twice so far. So this is before there's limits on how quickly you can run for consul again. We'll see in 10 years, a law gets passed that says you can't run for office in consecutive years. And it will get to the point where a consul can only come once every 10 years. But that is not a law yet. Okay, so that's what Appius Claudius is saying. Put me as dictator, and through brute force, I will deal with this problem. Well, as the Senate's arguing it, talking it over, they agree that this is the best approach. That we should forgive the debt of the soldiers and at least honor the word of Servilius. That's what they agree should happen. But in practice, what ends up happening here? Here you are a senator and I am a senator. It turns out none of my debt comes from these guys. Half the debt you own comes from these guys. And so what's really happening here is you're agreeing to give up half your wealth in this agreement, whereas I lose nothing, because all my debt is from these other guys. And so in these disputes over who's losing their private property and who's not losing their private property, while they all agree that something like this is the best approach, they can't agree on how to split it up. And so they decide, all right, guess we're going to have to go with the dictator.
He's the source of all these problems.
Not because it's the best solution, but because it's the only solution we're ever going to agree upon.
Guess that's true.
So that's what they do. They decide that they're going to appoint a dictator, and they're getting ready to appoint Appius Claudius dictator. Now, as they're getting ready to appoint him, once again, lucky for Rome, the Volsci, the Aquii, and the Sabines had all organized attacks on Rome. And so, once again, the Senate gets word that these guys are now going to attack them. They then think better of appointing Appius Claudius as the dictator. And so they instead appoint a man, Manius Valerius, who is the brother of Pubukola. Remember, Pubukola, friend of the people. So they agreed to appoint a dictator and then changed their minds last minute about who should be the dictator when they got some news about what's going on in the outside world. And so now someone who's seen as a friend of the people, he's the one that gets appointed dictator. And now their first job to him is to, we need you to levy the army and go fight the wars. Once again, we got these three enemies coming after us. And so, him being appointed dictator, he takes on his responsibility, and that's what he sets out to do. Go ahead.
Didn't all of those enemies sue for peace? Wasn't that a real thing?
They're really mad. I don't think they can dig around.
There's a lot of back and forth fighting, and don't have a lot of years written up here. This can often be spread over years, things building up and turning over. So I'm not sure how much time has passed since they last attacked. But it's been at least a year since we have new consoles. Okay, so once again, the Volsci, the Acquii, and the Sabines are all going to come and attack the poor Romans. Manius Valerius, his job is to somehow get the plebeians to once again agree to sign up as soldiers and go fight these various fights. Now, he makes the exact same type of pleas that Servilius made before him. Very similar ones. And once again, he promises that he will do everything in his power to deal with this debt problem when it's over. Now, in the minds of the plebeians, before they only had a consul agreeing to help him, this time they have a dictator. If there is any hope of this problem being solved, it's going to be solved by a dictator. So this is their last chance. So they agree with the dictator. He's able to levy the armies. They need a massive army. So he's able to levy 10 legions. I think each legion at this time would have been 3,000 men. So this would have been maxing out the military capabilities of Rome at the time. Basically, any military-aged man who's capable of fighting is being levied into this army. Everyone's on board. Now, they have to fight on 3 fronts. So the way that they do it is 3 legions come down here with one of the consuls to fight the Volsci. 3 legions are coming over here to deal with the Aquians. And then 4 legions with the dictator are coming up to fight the Sabines, because the Sabines are the bulk of the fighting. So, dictator with 4 legions, consul with 3, consul with 3. That's how they're splitting up the 10 legions. Roughly 9,000 men, 12,000 men, I think. Good so far on the picture? Mm-hmm. All right. So briefly, how do each of these battles go? So we'll start with what goes on down here with the Volsci. So down there with the Volsci, the Volscians outnumber the Romans, not drastically, but they outnumber the Romans. And so what the consul has them do is to stand out in the field, and typically you do like you're screaming back and forth at each other, you know, working yourself up into a rage, getting ready to fight, trying to intimidate the other side. The consul here tells his men, you're not allowed to make a sound. Furthermore, we're going to go and we're going to line up. You're going to hold your spears up. You're not going to get in formation. Your job is to look terrified, and that is your only job. So they are pretending to be absolutely terrified, don't want to be there for the fight. So there they are lined up, not even putting their spears down the way that they're supposed to. So here they are. The Volsci, they're over here trying to intimidate them. They outnumber them a good amount. They say these guys look absolutely terrified. They're not even forming up, they're so scared. What are these, new recruits? Are you kidding me? And so when they see how terrified the Romans look, they just can't help themselves. They kind of charge at them. So they break formation, kind of just charging at them. And what the Romans were told to do is, when they charge at you, we're not worrying about the spear. We're not using the spear. You're going to drop your spear and instantly draw your sword, because it's going to be close combat. And so they're going to be shocked at how fast suddenly they withstand the attack. And so that's exactly what happens. The Volsci charge at them, thinking it's going to be an easy victory. They're going to instantly try running off the field. They're exhausted by the time they get there. They've been screaming their lungs out, and they were the ones who just ran across the battlefield to you. And suddenly the Romans pull out their swords and just start mowing them down. And so the plan works perfectly. And so as quickly as they're charging there, they're turning around and booking it the other way. And that's when the Romans charge them down, win a great victory against the Volsci. So the Volsci, they rush at him, then they dash away. Good old Russian dash. Okay, so that's what's going on in this one. The war with the Aquians. The Aquians, what they're doing is they went in their little area. They found the biggest hill that they could find, nice and steep. They went on top of that hill and they built a nice good fort. And they put their army inside that hill. And so the Romans, here they are, out by the hill. Basic military tactics. You do not attack uphill. That's a very bad idea. Even worse, you do not attack uphill onto a fortified position. That's an even worse idea. So they're kind of stuck here waiting, trying to get the Acquii to come out and fight. And they do things like raid surrounding villages, pillaging stuff around, and they just cannot throw up these guys to come out and fight. So they're kind of just sitting there. Up here with the Sabines, where the dictator is, he uses some tactics that are not typically used. So what ends up happening is the Sabines, remember, they're also using the Phalanx formation. So what they do is they extend their lines very far compared to the Roman lines. So the Roman lines look something like that. The Sabines extend their lines out even further, trying to encircle the Romans. That's their plan. Now, since they're so stretched out, they're kind of thin up the middle. And so before the battle even starts, what the dictator does is he charges his cavalry at the middle of their lines. That is not normally done. The cavalry is typically used to attack the flanks. But they're thin enough that the cavalry is able to break through. And remember, with your phalanx formation, once your side is exposed, you're done for. And so after the cavalry break through and get behind them, and break a hole through, and then they engage, now they're just done for. And he wins a great victory against the Sabines. According to Levy, this is now the second most famous battle Rome has fought. The only one more famous was the Battle of Lake Regulus, where they beat the Latins. And that's because of how fierce it was and the famous people involved. So that type of tactic, I think that's the first time this is being used in Rome. Actually using your cavalry, basically using shock cavalry tactics.
When have the Sabines ever won?
They didn't record those battles. I don't know.
Oh, that's a good point. Biased perspective.
But, I mean, you don't become the Romans by losing battles.
It's true.
So, I mean, it's only the exceptions. How many city-states out there that tried to ultimately keep growing their control? On just the Roman Peninsula. And how many of them were successful? One. So,
It's true. So there's some facts to
Right,
back
I mean-
up their story.
they definitely came out on top. No question there. Okay, so anyways, the war down here with the Volsci, amazing victory. That army is ready to return to Rome. Amazing victory up here with the Sabines. That army is now returning to Rome. The Aquians are still on their hill with the Roman army camped off the hill, trying to get them to come down. They're not coming down. Very frustrating. So they're still stuck down there. What ends up happening is the army is starting to get worried that their consul is keeping them there on purpose. This is going over months now.
Yeah.
So they're worried that their consul is keeping them down here on purpose, and they think that the patricians put together this plan that they'll intentionally keep the army away from Rome until Manius Valerius's dictatorship expires, because it only lasts for 6 months. So they think that they're intentionally doing this to outlast the dictatorship. That way the dictator can't actually help us with debt relief. And so after a while of waiting, the plebeians finally say, we're going for it. And so they just charge up the hill, at the fortifications, at the Aquii. The Aquii are completely shocked by this. You do not do this. Right? It's like me holding a gun at you while you got a toothpick, and I watch you charge at me. Like, this can't be real. What is going on? And they charge up, and the Aquii are so shocked by this and frightened by this, they run away. And they don't even end up fighting them.
That's great.
And so they drag the Aquii back to deeper into their lands. They're not able to win a victory because they got all the plunder of the camp that was right there. So, hey, they get a victory there. So, terrible tactics ended up working. So that's what ends up happening with those. Upon returning to Rome, once again, Manius Valerius is blocked from passing any sort of debt reform. Everything he tries to do, the patricians keep fighting him on it every step of the way, and he is,
the dictator.
yes, the dictator.
How do you block it?
How is that possible?
Because he wasn't going to force under death to get the legislation through. So he's not going to go around killing senators who won't agree to it. But he's still trying to use all his power and influence to get these laws passed, and the patricians just won't have it. And so he becomes very upset with the patricians. And so he tells them, basically, if you're not going to let me do this, I'm done. I'm stepping down from the dictatorship. You will not let me recommend concord. Trust me, before long you will wish the people of Rome had patrons similar to me. Now, it's worth keeping in mind how the patricians view themselves to the plebs. Even though there's some patricians that despise the plebs, in large part the patricians view themselves as the father figures of the plebs. And so that's how they're supposed to act, is fatherly towards the people. That's what all the etymology of all these words comes from, ultimately comes from fathers in some sense or some way. The patricians are the fathers. That's how Livy often refers to them, is, and the fathers said, da, 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 or the fathers did, da, da, da. They're referred to as the fathers. And so he's warning them that you're going to wish that there were fathers like me to the people here in a second. For my part, I will neither further disappoint my fellow citizens, nor will I be dictator to no purpose. You appointed me dictator to deal with this problem abroad and this problem at home, and now you're actively blocking me from dealing with the problem at home. So internal divisions and foreign wars caused the Republic to require such a magistrate, required me to be dictator. Peace has been secured abroad, and it's impeded at home. It's impeded at home because of you, patricians. I will be a witness to these disturbances as a private citizen rather than a dictator. So, you told me to do the job, and now you're blocking me from doing the job. I'm not going to pretend to try and do the job anymore to put on the show. So he steps down from the dictatorship before it even expires. He abdicates from the position, which also isn't a very common thing. Dictator is kind of a cush job. Typically, when you're appointed dictator, you accomplish a task, and then you enjoy the benefits of being the head of the state for the rest of your time. And then you step down when your 6 months are over. So he abdicates from the most cush position in Rome. And so when he abdicates and goes home, the people are very aware of what he just did, and he's absolutely loved and applauded by the people as he heads home. And now, when he steps down from the position of dictator, the Senate is terrified. What are they terrified about? The army. And they can't afford to not have an army. Now remember these guys waiting at the bottom of the hill. They're waiting at the bottom of the hill when he abdicates. So this army was still out. And when an army takes on the military oath, they take on the military oath to answer to some consul until the war is over. So 2 of the 3 armies have returned to Rome, and they're no longer under the military oath, so to speak. This army that's been delayed is still out there. And so once they deal with the Acquii, the Senate then tells them, the Volscians are causing some problems, go see what you can do about it. Basically, coming up with the reasons to keep them out in the field. They can't let them come back home, because then their oath is over, and then Rome will lose its army altogether. So they got to keep this one army busy in case anything comes up.
But doesn't that, like, make them even more upset? Because they were trying to
It makes them upset, but they are not going to violate their oath. When you take your oath to the gods that you will do this thing. And it's understood in Rome, because one of the things they do is consider killing the consul, and then your oath expires. But their religious officials tell them, no, you can't get out of your oath by killing an official. Your oath is with the gods until this is done. And so they're not going to break their oath, so they consider killing their consul, but they decide against it. And so one army is kept out in the field, while the other 2 are back to regular citizens. Good so far? Okay, so now, imagine you're one of these soldiers. Once again, you agreed to put up your name, you went out, you fight, you come back home, and you find out the guy who said that he would help you with debt relief, he himself can't do it. And so they are completely disheartened. So 2 of the 3 armies, they up and leave Rome. And they cross the Anio to what's called the Sacred Mount. And they go on the Sacred Mount, they build up a fortification, and now 2 of the 3 armies are stationed there. So now Rome is back to panicking. Because one of their armies are out, in the field dealing with the Volsci. 2 of their armies just went and built a camp, even though they're technically not supposed to be in the military anymore, on a hill next to Rome. Are they getting ready to attack and come down and fight us? And we've got these plebs in the city itself who are very discontented, and they weren't even sure what they wanted to happen with those plebs. Do we wish that they would leave the city and go join the guys on the hill, or are we glad that they didn't go? And so, once again, patricians, very panicked, not sure what to do to deal with this. And so that brings us to the first secession of the plebs. Do we have time? I think we have time to get to this last slide. We'll make this our last slide. Okay, so what ends up happening is, once again, they need to entreat with the plebs how they're going to deal with this problem. And so, Menenius Agrippa is sent from the Senate to treat with the plebs out on the Sacred Mount and to come to some terms in agreement with them, which is going to be a hard thing to do because they've been burned a couple times. And so, in addressing him, first off, he was someone that was loved by the people, and he's someone who, he takes his job as a patrician, a father to the people, seriously. He actually wants to help the people. So, someone that has a good reputation with the people, he goes to him. And he starts out by giving him some analogy before addressing him. He says, there was a time when the body was not united with itself. And the limbs realized, the legs, they would run as the man chased like his food supply and hunted, and the arms, they would fight and kill. And all this work was done by all the extremities to ultimately provide it with food that would put in its mouth and just go straight to the stomach. Here the stomach just sat there, and the rest of the body works to feed the stomach. The legs chase after the food, the arm captures and cuts up the food, even the mouth, it chews up the food, all this for the sake of the stomach, which just sits there and does nothing. So one day the limbs decide to rebel against the stomach, and they decide that they were done gathering up food only to feed the stomach. And as the limbs start to wither away, they discovered that while it looks like the stomach sits there and does nothing, it's actually what provided the nutrients to the blood that ultimately sustained the limbs. And so his analogy, as he's talking about the stomach, is like to the Senate of Rome. And so even though in your guys' mind the Senate just sits there and does nothing, it's actually the life's blood of this republic that we have. And it's what's keeping internally everything going. So he starts out with that analogy, which already seems to soften them up some. And so he starts negotiating with them. And here's what they decide to instantiate. And what they decide to instantiate is the office of the tribune of the plebs. Now, we already talked about that office some before. This is its first time now coming into existence. And so what is agreed upon is that there will be, it was either initially 2 tribunes of the plebs or it was 5, but either way it quickly became 5. So we'll pretend it was 5. So what's agreed upon is that there will be 5 tribunes of the plebs. They will be elected by the council of plebs, so only plebs can vote on who these people are. And, well, we'll get to how they were elected here in a second. But what is the idea behind the tribune of the plebs? One of the things that the plebs were often doing that terrified the senators is they kept meeting in private groups to decide how to vote on whatever the Senate put forward. And what they thought was very dangerous was a bunch of plebeians getting together as individual groups, basically acting like a legislative body. So the idea of the tribune of the plebs is it's like the entire power of the assembly of the plebs in one person, so that you can be decisive. You don't need to all meet together and decide how to vote on some particular thing or whether some law will hurt you or not. You guys can just vote on someone to represent you, and the powers can be in him. And so that will help save us from these individual councils of people dealing with things. Now, on top of that, since he has the powers of the tribune of the plebs, or he has the power of the public assembly, he himself can instantly veto any actions that you feel like are violating your liberty. So there's no debt reformation that's done. Instead, what's appointed is this office of the tribune of the plebs to protect the people. And so now, if I, as a creditor, try locking you up for something, a tribune can veto that action. Say, nope, you don't get to do that. So a tribune of the plebs, they're able to veto. They're able to veto both laws that the Senate is trying to put forward, as well as individual actions that someone is trying to carry out. A consul could say, I want to gather the people to levy in for the army. Tribune of the plebs could veto that action. They're given a tremendous amount of power. Now, their only power is really to say no, but they can say no to pretty much anything. So it's a strong power. On top of that, they're sacrosanct. So to interfere with them or to ignore their veto is death. If they're trying to stop an action from happening, you can't interfere. You can't in some way try to prevent them from carrying out that action. And if you try to physically stop them or inflict violence on them in any way, that's a death penalty for you. Can't hurt these guys. Now, tribunes' powers only exist in the Pomerium. So they can't go out in the countryside doing whatever they want. Keep in mind, outside of the Pomerium, it's Imperium that rules. And it's a military force that rules outside the Pomerium. So this is only a power inside the Pomerium. So they can't go messing with anything anywhere that they want. And so, the Councilium Plebeius is now going to be the council, only composed of plebs, that votes for these guys. Now, a big caveat is the Council of Plebs is initially following the Comitia Centuria. So they're initially voting the way that the Comitia Centuriata does, which means that wealthy plebs have more say in who gets elected than poorer plebs. So this is not voting based off of tribe, where each tribe gets one vote. This is voting based off of what's it called? When you assess how much wealth they have. The census, thank you. So it's being determined based off of the census is what's determining how much of a say you have. Now that's big for the patricians, because in a lot of ways, a patrician and a wealthy pleb have goals that align. So it's going to force the patricians to negotiate with the plebs, but just the wealthier plebs, and that will be enough to make sure that the tribune they want gets elected. So patricians are still going to have a lot of power here over who becomes the tribune of the plebs. Not because they have any say, but because the wealthy plebs alone almost decide who it is. And then the last thing that the tribune of the plebs is able to do is propose these plebeian laws that apply to all of the plebs. So they can propose those laws, and the council of the plebeians can vote on those laws to accept the laws. And those then become laws there in Rome. But laws only for the plebeians. These are not laws over the patricians. So this is going to be the first step in their big compromise towards bringing these two powers together. And we'll see it continue from here as the plebs slowly get more and more power in the city of Rome. So you can see how they teeter on that edge of almost going to the tipping point. You see how easily it could have been that they rally around one man, he becomes a tyrant in Rome, kills the patricians, redistributes the wealth, and solves the problem that way. And that would have been the typical case, the typical scenario. And then the city would have gone through its cycles that would have gone through that other city-states did. So Rome has already done something very exceptional here that doesn't happen. They amended their constitution to adjust to the situation at hand. And this is what the Romans are going to be phenomenal at, is adapting to whatever the situation requires. Now here's our first adaptation in giving the plebeians more rights. We're going to see that happen more and more to keep the plebeians satisfied until plebeians are almost on par with patricians, except in terms of status.
That's awesome.
Any questions? Go ahead.
Is this really the origin of that stomach analogy? Like,
No idea.
Is that a common analogy?
I didn't know that was a common
Yeah,
one.
I've heard that several times.
Ah.
I think it's in the Book of Virtues.
I have no clue the origins of that. As far as I can recollect in my memory, that was the first time I ever read it, but I could be wrong. Maybe I did come across it, just don't remember it. I don't have a great memory. So I have no idea.
It seems like why on earth wouldn't they just limit the amount of interest you can charge? Like, it seems like that would be.
That's one of the things coming. So two things are going to happen. First, they're going to limit the amount of interest you can charge to 100%. And then down the road,
That's
they
still insane.
put a law that you can't charge interest. But what ends up happening in effect is it turns into you can charge 12% interest. And interest basically becomes standardized at 12% interest rates.
Yeah, that's reasonable.
That's all right.
So even though on paper it's supposed to be 0, in reality it turns into 12, and that's simply because at 0 no one can borrow anything, and that creates its own problems.
Exactly. Exactly.
I got to pay taxes. If I can't even borrow money to pay my taxes, now the state has to deal with my debt rather than a private citizen dealing with my debt.
Yep. It just seems like they're so extreme. Forgive all debt or not, and it's just like, why was it so difficult to find a more reasonable ground?
Probably a lot to do with enforcement. I mean, a lot of these things, it's not like there's an institution that you go to borrow the money. You go to Jack and say, hey, can I borrow some money? And he says, yeah, 150%. You go to Frank and say, can I borrow some money? Yeah, 120%. You go to John and say, can I borrow some money? He says, yeah, 100%. Oh, thanks, John. You're a pal. So it's not any sort of standardized institutions, and I don't know. You can always, you're also talking people into giving up their money, saying, why don't you just pass a law that you can't charge the interest rate that you are charging that's making you so wealthy?
Yeah, it's like
Because
their
that's what's
whole
happening for a
career.
lot of patricians.
Their whole career is lending money.
So we'll see it happen, and Rome will adapt and change interest rate laws. But yeah, early on, forgiving debt was a big thing because interest rates were just insane, and people who charged interest on loans were just hated in ancient times. And you can see why. You would absolutely hate the man, you know, that imagine your father's the one who took out the loan, and now you live your life in servitude for something that wasn't even your doing. And you know the circumstances of it where he pretty much had no choice.
Yeah.
You can see how that might drive you to kill
Oh,
people
yeah.
you owe money to and
Absolutely.
appoint a tyrant, which would have been the normal course.
Of course.
Of course. That would have been of course.
It's amazing. It really teaches you appreciation for what you have here in America.
America's a great place to live.
Yep.
Okay. Anything else? Cool. Plan on next week.